Hi folks, Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio radio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about Winston Churchill's determination to fight on in World War II, even though Britain's position was desperate. And why did he do that, given that Britain was either going to be defeated militarily or economically, but it was going to be defeated either way. Now, militarily, Britain sort of prevailed only because of huge American support and presence, but financially they were almost destroyed by World War II. So the defeat of Britain in one or the other ways was inevitable given that situation. So yet Churchill decided to fight on. Now, it's clear with the people who were around Churchill at the time, who later on wrote memoirs, and Alan Brooke being among them, that said that Churchill's estimation of British military and financial and industrial capability was really the Britain of his youth. When he was in his mid-20s, Britain was still a great power, fast being eclipsed, but still a great power. And that was the Britain that Churchill, a child of empire, that was the Britain that sort of emotionally Churchill envisaged. It was a great power. It was astride the world stage, and it had the financial, industrial, and military capability to oppose its foes and defeat them, and to prevail through protracted struggles and so on and so forth. So this was the image, the emotional image that Churchill had, and he would frequently refer to this, that Britain was going to roll, Nazis were in control of Europe, but Britain was going to roll back the Nazis, was going to defeat them on land and on sea and in the air, and liberate Europe, and Britain would once again be the great power it was in the 1880s and this sort of thing. So this is very much Churchill's take on things, and it was a very emotional take. Constantly, the people around him had to remind him that the Britain of 1940 didn't have anywhere near, not even close, anywhere near the resources in any necessary category, anywhere near the resources to be able to adequately oppose, let alone defeat, Nazi Germany at the time. So now this was something that Churchill would kind of accept when all his counsellors and advisors would, but then he would break out into emotional states every now and again, and would hark back to those days of his youth when Britain indeed was a great power. Now, when Churchill was born, Britain was indeed a great power, no question of that, but it was already being fast eclipsed by a number of other powers. And the three that were doing it were Germany, Japan, and the United States. Now, Japan sort of shocked the Western world when it defeated the Russians in really two wars, between 1895 and 1905, primarily naval conflict, and then one that was a naval military sort of combo, but the Japanese winning on both occasions, and winning quite decisively, really. But the rise of Japan, that had come from being a feudal state into being really a regional power in Asia, meant that the Japanese Navy was quite substantial, and it's something that the British had to take into account, because their far-flung empire across the world had to take into account, their wargaming strategists and tacticians had to look at this, okay, well, what would we do if we had to fight a war with Japan? So those sort of gaming was going. So there was Japan, a rising Japan. United States, populace, a lot of British investment going into the United States too, and a lot of inventions coming out of the US, and clearly in Germany too, a lot of inventions in chemical engineering, precision engineered steel, optics, a whole range of things, electronics. So in the new technologies, Britain was being fairly quickly eclipsed by certainly Germany and the United States, and particularly after Germany federated, its population was close to double that of Britain. So not only was a much more populous nation. In addition, Germany and the United States were using a lot of tariffs to protect local industries, not to protect them to be inefficient and useless and flabby, but to protect them to be able to produce, top quality, world class, leading edge, high quality goods that could be exported around the world. So Britain lost twice. Their goods are unable to penetrate those markets because of the protection. But because Britain had low tariffs, the good quality products that were made behind those tariff walls in Britain and Germany were then being exported to Britain, which meant there was less incentive in the British industry to invest in those new technologies, given you could buy such good quality products so cheaply or competitively from Britain and from United States and Germany. And something I've mentioned numerous times was the American, I think it was Colt, or one of the handgun sales guys, came to Britain and he got 6 guns, broke them all up into pieces, put them in a box, asked the assembled British potential buyers to jumble everything up, and then he just instantly reassembled 6 hand pistols from those jumbled up parts. And the British, were in awe of this. Oh, wow, holy fuck! Because in Britain at the time they didn't have standards of engineering. And so if a handgun was made in factory A, then it would be a few microns different, ostensibly the same design, but a few microns different from one factory B. So the parts weren't interchangeable. And the British actually didn't solve the interchangeability really until the 1930s, which was a big issue, of course. So this sort of precision engineering, mass production, all this sort of stuff, the British were being left behind. Now, because the British, insurance and capital raising, shipping, half the ships in the world were British ships using to, merchant navy transporting goods around. Because of that, the decline in British industry and decline in British technology, although not total, but the decline in that those technologies meant that Britain was falling behind in the new industries, which is where the new wealth and the new industrial capacity was being created. So by the 1890s, Britain was already in a decline because it had such a decent head start. That decline wasn't immediate and obvious, but it was there. And if you look back at the media articles of the time, this was being, there were people around who were concerned about it and figured that, hey, if this continues, Britain will be falling behind the United States and Germany in terms of industrial and financial capacity, which indeed they were. Now, if you look at the new range of the dreadnought class, if you like, battleships that were running on oil, the dreadnought class battleships, which were the latest technology of the time, they were still trendsetters. So in shipbuilding and Britain was still way up there. But if you look at the Japanese ships that were being laid down at the time, they were easily comparable, if not better in some ways, than the British ships were. So the British war gamers in even in like 1905, 1906, the British war gamers were coming to realise that in reality they just simply couldn't compete globally, even in the Navy, where the British had a very substantial Navy, and that was their strong suit. And they realised that if they had to fight, say, Germany, Italy, and Japan at the same time, they didn't have the resources to do it. They just couldn't do it. They had to. Okay, we've got to cut a deal with Japan. We can, if we send a big enough force over to the Far East to fight Japan, if we're at war with Japan, then we don't have enough resources to fight Germany and Italy in the North Sea and the home waters, as it were. So we've got to neutralise a possible threat from Japan by making them allies, so we can really keep our whole navy in home waters. So they realised that really to oppose a resurgent Germany and the very high quality ships and very high standard of training, the ships like the Tirpitz and all that sort of thing that they were producing in Germany in the early and mid and even later 1900s, the British realised we can't fight Germany, and we've only got just enough resources to fight Germany, and Italy if it comes to war. And even with the French Navy on side, the British were still of the view that they would have to keep pretty much their entire navy in home waters if they were going to fight that war. Such was the quality and the size and the number of ships in the German Navy. Again, this is early 1900s. So already the British were really, in reality, they were accepting that they were already on the cusp of being a second-rate power, particularly given the spread of their empire, because their wealth wasn't concentrated in the factories and the designs and the efficiency and the productive outcomes of the home island in Britain itself. Their wealth came from a far-flung empire and trading and so on, captive markets in the empire countries and such as Australia and the like. So this was something where given the British were passing up in this idea of a productive industrial sector as being the engine room of new wealth, particularly in the new industries, Britain was already slipping into a second-rate power status. And I'm not sure whether they actually saw it or thought that other events would intercede to somehow save them. They also were stuck in a mentality that had been applicable during, say, the Louis XIV, Napoleon Bonaparte era, where the assumption was that if they could ensure a balance of power on the European continent, then they could maintain supremacy in the seas and maintain supremacy of international commerce and trade. But they had to maintain that balance of power. That changed to where they had no capacity to maintain that, or insufficient capacity to maintain that balance of power following the 1870s and the unification of the German states into the German federal state. So the British no longer had that sort of power, that sort of clout, and they were quite caught by surprise in the Franco-Prussian War when the French were defeated so easily. Now, in World War One, the British again had fallen behind in the quality of goods, and so Germany was far ahead organisationally, industrially, and technically. And if you look at the casualties the German army were inflicting on the French and the British and the Russians, compared to the casualties they were sustaining themselves, and you can see there's a huge margin there where they're just better trained, better equipped, better led, better organised. So even though Britain and France together economically were kind of a match for Germany, but the reality is industrially the quality of the products that industrial products that Germans were making. The Germans were technologically ahead, industrially ahead, organisationally ahead, and this tipped the balance. And if America hadn't entered the war in 1917, there's no question that the British and the French would have been defeated at that time, which already was an indication that Britain was a power of the second rank at that time, as indeed was France. Now the alarm bells in a lot of ways should have gone off, because something I mentioned before, the Colt hand pistols having interchangeable parts. The British, even in the First World War, they still couldn't have interchangeable parts. A field cannon made in one factory, the parts weren't interchangeable with a field cannon, the same field cannon, ostensibly, made in another factory. Again, it was only a few microns and this and that, but the parts weren't interchangeable. So whereas in the German side they had the absolute highest quality steel manufacturing down to micron level, and everything was interchangeable, and much higher quality product that broke down far less, was damaged less easily, and so on. And this makes a huge difference. If you're supposed to have 100 heavy field cannons firing away, but one side's only got 50 because things are breaking, or you haven't got the spare parts to repair them, or this sort of thing, and the other side's firing 100 cannons, ostensibly you've got an army of the same size and capability, but one side's got just much better quality equipment. Many of the British shells didn't explode, whereas nearly all the German ones did. Again, the quality of work and manufacture were substantially different. Something that really wasn't corrected in a number of areas until World War II. The amount of torpedoes, British torpedoes, that that didn't detonate during World War II, whereas a very small number of German torpedoes didn't detonate. Things like that can make a huge difference to the outcome in war when you aggregate it over millions of combatants and multiple theatres of war. So come the Second World War, which is where I'm building up to it, Britain was no match for Japan in the Far East, no match at all for Germany in Europe, and was again a power of the second rank. Was no match for the United States. Was a power of the second rank. Now the top powers are usually usually only one or two that are running the show, and Britain had dropped to the second level. And even at the second level, they were just ordinary players, middleweight players at the second level. And as we saw, the British were effortlessly defeated by the Germans in France in 1940. It's only because the Luftwaffe decided to break off the engagement that the Royal Air Force hung on in the so-called Battle of Britain. In the naval engagements, the German pocket battleships effortlessly outclassed the British cruisers and so on. So really, Britain was already a power of the second rank in just about every way. And this is something that was quite clear. So as Churchill sat down to say, will we fight on? And remember, there's a lot of people in the British government and the cabinet that think, look, we've got to cut a deal with Hitler. We can't beat the guy. He's in control of France. He's in control of Norway and everything. We've got no chance of winning this. So Churchill hangs on, hoping that America will enter the war. But that's really the only card he's got to play. And only when Hitler decides to invade Russia did the pressure come off Britain to some extent. And the mere fact that Britain was still active in the war meant that tied down a number of German forces in the West that could have been used against Russia, and as Stalin readily conceded, if Hitler didn't have to commit so many forces to sort of monitoring Britain and all that sort of stuff, if Hitler didn't have to commit those forces, and he could have committed them to Russia, that they would the Nazis would have easily overwhelmed the Soviet Union at the time, and Stalin and his advisors readily concede this. So it was, Britain did play an inadvertent role, an indirect role in affecting the outcome of the war, but not because of their military and financial industrial capability, far from it. And even with all British factories running at full tilt, going hard at it, they still had to spend gazillions of dollars buying American-made war materiel in order just to even attempt to stay in the game. And because of that Britain had to sell itself out financially to the Americans, and the Americans heavily overestimated Britain's commercial capability at the time, and so the Americans overplayed their hand, and this meant that Britain was soundly defeated financially and industrially as a consequence of fighting the war. So now, what if Churchill or one of his another member of the government had cut a deal with Hitler? Would Hitler have stuck to the deal? Because Hitler's offer was that, look, leave me a free hand in Europe and you can do what the fuck you want elsewhere. Would Hitler have done that? They probably would have come with conditions like, you got to supply me with so much rubber, or there would have been conditions to it. But effectively, Britain could have avoided being destroyed financially by that war. And on balance, Hitler probably would have stuck to that deal. There was too much aggravation to not do it. So my guess is that would have saved Britain a whole lot of pain and suffering, because the victory was quite a hollow one and a Pyrrhic victory at best. So really, is it the case that Churchill's determination to go with the war was really his vision, a young man's vision of a once great empire that was no longer a great empire? Did that put the nail in the coffin of Britain to even be a serious second-rate power? You've been a task today, your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.